and immediate troop reductions in forward areas. Moving now to Europe, US President Donald Trump has offered to join potential peace talks between Ukraine and Russia, set to take place in Turkey later this week. Speaking from the White House before his trip to the Gulf region, Trump said he may fly to Istanbul on Thursday if he believes there's a real chance of progress. The talks come amid a push by European nations for a 30-day ceasefire, a proposal that Moscow has yet to formally respond to. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says he will be in Istanbul waiting for a meeting with President Vladimir Putin, but continued Russian attacks have cast doubts over Moscow's commitments. Let's listen in to what Trump said.
I think you may have a good result out of the Thursday meeting in Turkey between Russia and Ukraine, and I believe the two leaders were going to be there. I was thinking about flying over.
To hold talks after President Donald Trump offered to join prospective Ukraine-Russia talks later this week in Turkey. In the hours that followed, the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio held a call with European counterparts, including the foreign ministers of Britain and France, as well as the EU's foreign policy chief, to discuss a way forward for a ceasefire in Ukraine. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha and his German and Polish counterparts also took part in the call, according to a State Department readout. Additionally, Russia unleashed over 100 drones on Ukraine overnight, according to the Ukrainian Air Force. The attack came after the Kremlin rejected a 30-day unconditional ceasefire. In a related development, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky also said that he wants his American counterpart, President Trump, to join the peace talks with Russia in Turkey. This comes even as the Kremlin is silent about whether Putin would attend. Let's listen in to what Zelensky said.
Президент Ердоган висловив повну готовність прийняти зустріч. Важливо, що президент Трамп повністю підтримує зустріч. І ми б хотіли, щоб він знайшов можливість бути в Туреччині. Було також сьогодні дуже багато роботи з нашими партнерами, з американцями, з європейцями, дипломатична робота. На жаль, світ досі не отримав ясної відповіді з Росії щодо численних пропозицій припинити вогонь. Російські обстріли і штурми продовжуються. Москва увесь день мовчала щодо пропозиції прямої зустрічі. Дуже дивне мовчання. Все одно треба буде Росії закінчувати війну. І краще зробити це раніше. Немає сенсу продовжувати вбивство.
Well, joining us to discuss these latest developments in the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict is Professor Dr. Vasilin Ivanov-Popovsky, a professor and vice dean at the Jindal Global Law School, who's joining us from New Delhi. Thank you very much for being here, Professor Dr. Popovsky. Let's first look at what Donald Trump has said. Of course, we know he's going to the Gulf state for a visit, but what would his participation in these talks between Russia and Ukraine achieve?
Going to Istanbul. In fact, he can deliver a lot. If he simply tells Putin, pick up your phone, call your generals and cease fire, that will be historic. If Donald Trump really wants to remain in history and get a Nobel Peace Prize, that's what he should do. And there is no really any option left for Putin. Let's see first if Putin goes to Istanbul. He has no options. If he doesn't go to Istanbul, the entire world will understand who is against the ceasefire and the peace plan. And if he goes to Istanbul, he will be under extreme pressure to stop the fire. No less than that. Any other outcome of the Istanbul meeting will be a disaster for Putin and for Russia. So the only thing that, as I said, Trump needs to do is to go to Istanbul, to wait for Putin to come, and to tell him, take your phone, make a simple phone call and cease fire. Otherwise, I go out of this room, and the heaviest sanctions in the world history will be imposed on Russia. This is what should happen on Thursday. Let's see first what Putin does, whether he accepts or not, but he has no good options here left. By the way, it was his idea. Putin started, it's funny, Putin started with this meeting in Istanbul. He was the one proposing to meet Zelensky directly, and now he has no option left but to go and to face the embarrassment of either rejecting a ceasefire in front of the world or accepting ceasefire, which is what Donald Trump wants.
Yes, absolutely. It does seem, of course, that the European allies are trying to call Vladimir Putin out here, and Zelensky has jumped on that opportunity. Given how far away both sides are in terms of coming to an agreement, with Crimea being an important factor, NATO membership, as well as peacekeeping troops, areas in which both countries disagree on, is this ultimatum ultimately going to work, given the fact that the distance is so far between both nations?
I agree, Joshua. Maybe that's for longer term negotiations. But what we want to see is ceasefire. What everybody wants to see is ceasefire. Donald Trump wants to see a ceasefire for the last 60 days. Zelensky agreed on that terms of 30-day ceasefire, unconditional ceasefire. This is what everybody was repeating for 2 months. And there is one man in the world, Vladimir Putin, who rejects that. It's very clear. Ceasefire first. No negotiations are possible if the armies continue to fight. A simple phone call to the generals to stop fire, and the next minute, even in Istanbul, they can sit on the same table where they are in Istanbul and start talking about everything else, territories, sanctions, and future security guarantees and everything else.
Absolutely. And Professor Dr. Popovsky, to bring an end to this discussion, we've heard a lot from European leaders. We know that the US Secretary of State has spoken with European foreign secretaries in recent hours. But what role could China and potentially other countries play in these discussions?
Yes, you are right. We have United States and Europe now united, finally, and very importantly, because these are the biggest power, United States and European Union, but also Japan, South Korea, Australia, Canada. Many countries will be joined in that. Now, China, Xi Jinping visited Moscow on the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, but the visit looked very interestingly. It was Xi Jinping basically saying, Russia is my slave. I can do whatever I want. In fact, it was the Chinese who provided the security of that Red Square in Moscow. In fact, it was a very interesting message to the world that China is putting Russia under its arm and it can do whatever Xi Jinping wants with Russia. So it was not a victory for Putin at all that Xi Jinping was in Moscow. Absolutely not. China has its own global strategic vision, and it may also include a ceasefire. Actually, China would demand territorial sovereignty and independence of Ukraine, and it's always been the case. China does want a global world order, which will allow it to trade and to have a freedom of movement, freedom of trade. These are all very important Chinese objectives. So again, I don't see any chance for Vladimir Putin anymore. Even China will definitely show some general support, but will demand ceasefire, peace in Ukraine, and obviously territorial sovereignty and independence for Ukraine as well.
Yes, Professor Dr. Veselin Ivanov Popovsky, thank you ever so much as always for joining us. All eyes will be